My name is Emily Louisa. I'm 32. Last October, I realized my life was a financial trap. For 7 years, I paid every cent of my parents' mortgage while my older brother lived there rent-free. He even kicked me out of my childhood bedroom to build a gaming cave. When I confronted my mom and asked for my room back, she called me a selfish failure right at the dinner table. But then I found a public county record that made my blood run cold. Without telling me, she and my brother had taken out a secret second mortgage on that exact house to fund his crypto investments, which he lost. They left me on the hook for everything. I did not cry or scream. I just gathered 84 wire transfer receipts and waited for their big 35th anniversary party. Before I tell you what the bank foreclosure agent did when he walked into that room, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me your age and where you are listening from in the comments. The story actually begins at my desk in a Pennsylvania healthcare network. I work as a medical compliance auditor. My job is to find the things other people hide. I spend 40 hours a week staring at billing codes, cross-referencing patient charts, and tracking down missing funds. I am paid to notice when a number does not belong. I am good at it because I do not let emotion cloud the math. Numbers do not lie. Numbers do not manipulate you or tell you that you are overreacting. That Tuesday afternoon, it was raining in Philadelphia. The water was hitting the third-floor window of my office building. I had just finished auditing a pulmonary clinic. I saved the network thousands of dollars just by catching a duplicated billing sequence. I closed my laptop, rubbed my eyes, and checked my personal bank account on my phone. It was the first of the month. I watched the automatic withdrawal process. $2,200 vanished from my checking account, transferred directly to a mortgage lender in Chester County. I sat there and stared at the updated balance. My apartment is small. The radiator clanks in the winter. The carpet is a faded tan. I drive a sedan that has 90,000 miles on it. I eat packed lunches at my desk. Every financial decision I make is calculated, measured, and restrained. Yet the largest expense of my life was a house I did not live in. I paid for the manicured lawn. I paid for the central air conditioning. I paid for the roof over a dining room table where I was no longer welcome to sit without an invitation. For 7 years, I told myself I was doing the right thing. I told myself I was the anchor holding my family together. The truth is much colder. I was not an anchor. I was a battery, and they were draining me dry. The realization did not happen all at once. It started as a low hum in the back of my mind, a creeping discomfort that something was fundamentally wrong with the arrangement. I had built a life based on a quiet agreement. I pay the bills, my father gets to stay in his home, and I receive the unspoken approval of a mother I spent my whole life trying to please. It was a transaction disguised as love. But transactions require audits. And that Tuesday, looking at the rain against the glass, the auditor in me finally woke up to my own life. The math of my family did not add up. The blind loyalty I had been running on was failing. I just did not know how deep the deficit went until I started looking. To understand how I ended up funding a life I was excluded from, you have to understand the panic that put the pen in my hand 7 years ago. 7 years ago, my father collapsed in the driveway. He was carrying a bag of mulch. It was a Tuesday then, too. The stroke hit the left side of his brain and wiped out 30 years of steady income in the time it took him to hit the pavement. Before that afternoon, my father was a regional manager for a plumbing supply company. He was the kind of man who kept his retirement projections in a leather binder on his desk. After the stroke, he became a man who needed help holding a glass of water. The hospital bills arrived before he even came home from rehab. Then came the insurance denials for the specialized physical therapy. Finally, the letters from the mortgage company began to stack up on the kitchen counter. My mother, Susan, stopped opening the mail. She would just sit at the table, drinking coffee, staring at the envelopes as if they were venomous snakes. I was 25. I had just landed my first real job out of college, working in accounts receivable at a local hospital. I was making $45,000 a year. It felt like a fortune. It was exactly enough to make me dangerous to myself. I remember the night the house almost slipped away. It was late November. The heater was running. My mother called me into the kitchen. She looked exhausted. The skin around her eyes was bruised with lack of sleep. She had the bank paperwork spread out under the overhead light. They were 90 days behind. The lender was threatening to accelerate the loan. She looked at me and said, "Emily, they are going to take the house. Where will your father go?" She did not ask me for money. That is the thing you have to understand. People like my mother rarely ask for what they want directly. They build the stage, light the fire, and wait for you to throw yourself on it. I looked at the numbers. The outstanding balance was $240,000. The monthly payment with property taxes and insurance escrow was $2,200. My brother Greg was 27 at the time. He was living in Austin, bouncing between tech startups that never seemed to launch. He was not an option. I stepped into the silence. I told her I would handle it. I told her I would take over the payments. The relief on her face was immediate. For the first time in my life, my mother looked at me not as the quiet, boring daughter, but as the solution. It is a terrifyingly powerful drug, validation from someone who has always withheld it. I drank it down and ignored the bitter aftertaste. We needed to refinance to pull out some cash to cover the medical arrears and adjust the term. Because my parents' credit was destroyed by the missed payments, the bank required a co-signer. I drove to the title company on my lunch break. The closing room smelled like cheap coffee and lemon polish. The loan officer slid a stack of paper across the polished mahogany table. There were blue sticky notes pointing to the signature lines. I signed my name 34 times. I bound myself to $250,000 in debt. I am an auditor. I deal in ledgers and liabilities. I know exactly how stupid it was. I agreed to guarantee the loan, but I never asked to be put on the deed. The house remained legally theirs. I assumed all of the risk and secured none of the equity. If you want to know how a smart person ruins her own life, it is by prioritizing family peace over a legal contract. I was afraid that asking for my name on the title would make it look like I was stealing my sick father's house. I was afraid my mother would pull back that look of approval. So I chose the path of least resistance. I chose to be a martyr. The ink was not even dry on the mortgage documents when my mother pulled out another set of papers. She had downloaded them from the internet. It was a durable power of attorney. She explained it away with a practiced wave of her hand. She said it was just standard procedure. With my father incapacitated, she needed the ability to make financial decisions quickly. She said she needed my signature too, just in case something happened to her and someone needed to manage the house payments. She called it a safety net. I barely glanced at it. I was so focused on being the hero, so overwhelmed by the sheer volume of paperwork and the smell of the closing room, that I skimmed the first page and flipped to the back. I signed it and had the notary stamp it. I did not read the fine print. I did not see the clauses granting the agent the authority to pledge, mortgage, or otherwise encumber real estate. I did not realize I was handing my mother the keys to my financial future. At the time, I truly believe she did not intend to use it against me. It was born of genuine panic. She was a woman watching her life collapse, grabbing at every lever of control she could find. She wanted the power of attorney because it made her feel safe. But that document was a loaded gun left on the coffee table. For the next 5 years, I lived in my cramped apartment and paid the mortgage on the Chester County house. Every month, $2,200 left my account. I skipped vacations. I drove my old car. I bought clothes on clearance. I convinced myself I was doing something noble. I was the silent engine keeping the family running. The arrangement worked. My father stayed in his home. The letters from the bank stopped. My mother occasionally thanked me. It was a fragile, expensive peace. But peace built on a flaw is just a countdown. I had constructed a cage out of my own willful blindness and locked myself inside. I just did not realize the key had been handed to someone else. The illusion of stability held until Greg decided he was tired of Austin. He packed up his failure, slapped a new label on it, and drove back to Pennsylvania. That is when the ground beneath my feet really started to crack. 2 years ago, the dynamic shifted. Greg moved back to Pennsylvania. He did not arrive in defeat. He arrived in a rented van, carrying 3 curved monitors, a custom desktop tower, and a narrative of impending wealth. He is my older brother. He is 34. He is not a villain plotting in the shadows. He is just a man profoundly terrified of his own mediocrity. He spent his 20s chasing the horizon. He tried dropshipping in Miami. He tried real estate wholesaling in Phoenix. Every venture ended with a quiet retreat and a new explanation for why the market failed him. This time, the pitch was decentralized finance, cryptocurrency, algorithmic trading. He set his bags down in the entryway and immediately began talking about liquidity pools and blockchain architecture. He used vocabulary that sounded expensive. My mother, Susan, absorbed every syllable. She looked at him with the kind of reverence she usually reserved for television evangelists. To her, Greg was not an unemployed man moving back into his childhood home. He was a visionary who just needed a temporary incubator. I watched the house change. It happened slowly at first. A tub of high-end whey protein appeared on the kitchen island. A pair of $300 running shoes sat by the front door. The internet bill went up $80 a month to support gigabit speeds, a statement Susan quietly handed to me during a Sunday visit. I paid it. I was already paying the $2,200 mortgage. I convinced myself another $80 was just the cost of keeping the peace. Then came the physical displacement. My childhood bedroom was at the end of the second-floor hallway. It was small. It still had the faded floral wallpaper I picked out when I was 12. My high school track medals were in a shoebox in the closet. It was the only space in that house that still held a record of my existence. I did not sleep there, but the room was a placeholder. It meant I still belonged. I went over on a Saturday morning in November. I walked through the front door and saw 3 cardboard boxes stacked at the bottom of the stairs. The top box was open. I saw the spine of my old high school yearbook. I walked up the stairs. The door to my room was wide open. The twin bed was gone. The dresser was gone. In their place sat a sleek, glass-top desk. The 3 curved monitors were mounted on hydraulic arms. A tangle of black cables snaked across the hardwood floor. Greg was standing by the window, measuring the frame for blackout curtains. He looked at me and offered a tight smile. He said the basement humidity was bad for his processing units. He said he needed natural light to regulate his circadian rhythm while trading global markets. He spoke as if he were managing a hedge fund in Manhattan, not squatting in a house funded by his younger sister's clerical job. I walked back downstairs. My mother was in the kitchen. She was standing at the sink, rinsing a coffee mug. The smell of dish soap and old coffee filled the air. She did not turn around when I entered the room. I asked her why my belongings were in boxes in the hallway. She turned off the faucet. She dried her hands on a towel very deliberately. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She used the precise, measured tone she always deployed when she wanted to make me feel small. She said, "Greg is trying to build a future for all of us, Emily." I pointed toward the living room, where my father lay in his medical bed, staring at the ceiling, oblivious to the fact that his son was dismantling the house, piece by piece. I told her I was the one paying for the roof over that future. I told her I wanted my room left alone. She sighed. It was a heavy, theatrical sigh, designed to demonstrate her patience. She leaned against the counter. She told me I had my own apartment. She asked why I was clinging to a room I did not use. She said family helps family. She said I was being rigid, that I lacked vision, that I was letting resentment blind me to Greg's potential. She painted my request for basic respect as a character flaw. In a movie, this is the moment the protagonist sweeps the dishes off the counter and delivers a crushing speech. But in reality, trauma makes you tired. The constant friction of fighting someone who will never see your worth drains the energy right out of your bones. I looked at the boxes in the hall. I looked at the sponge in my mother's hand. I realized she was willing to sacrifice my tangible contribution for Greg's imaginary success. Greg offered her a lottery ticket. I offered her a municipal bond. She wanted the thrill of the gamble. I did what I had done my entire life. I retreated. I picked up the boxes. I carried them to the trunk of my car. I drove back to my cramped apartment. I stacked my childhood in the corner of my living room, and I let them have the space. Over the next 18 months, I watched the performance escalate. I would visit on Sundays and see the physical evidence of my brother's phantom wealth. A $400 ergonomic office chair arrived on the porch. A specialized cold brew coffee maker appeared on the counter. Packages from luxury athletic brands piled up in the recycling bin. I would sit at the dining room table, eating dry roast beef, listening to Greg talk about market capitalization and yield farming. My mother would nod, pouring him more wine. I would sit quietly, knowing that in 3 days, I would log into my banking portal and transfer my paycheck to keep the lights on for his trading floor. The tension simmered in the unspoken reality. I was funding the stage for his play. I swallowed my anger. I justified my silence with logic. I told myself that the cosmetic changes did not matter. Greg could buy all the office chairs he wanted. My mother could fawn over his monitors. Let them play pretend. I believed I was secure. I held the receipts for the primary mortgage. I was the guarantor of the fundamental debt. I thought my grip on that monthly payment meant the foundation of the house was locked safely in my hands. I told myself that as long as I managed the main ledger, they could not truly harm me. I thought my sacrifice was a shield. I was wrong. I was looking at the front door, making sure the deadbolt was secured. I did not know they had already handed a duplicate key to the bank. The first clue arrived in a plain white envelope, stamped with red ink, accidentally forwarded to my apartment. It was a Wednesday evening when the Postal Service made a routing error that unraveled the fabric of my life. I was checking the cluster of aluminum mailboxes in the lobby of my apartment building. The hallway smelled of wet wool and floor wax. I turned the small brass key, pulled the metal door open, and gathered a stack of grocery circulars and utility bills. Hidden in the middle of the stack was a standard business envelope. It bore a yellow sticker from the United States Postal Service. The sticker indicated a forwarding address. The letter had originally been mailed to the Chester County house, the home where my parents and brother lived, the home I paid for. For reasons I will never fully understand, a sorting machine or a tired letter carrier decided to reroute this specific piece of mail to my current apartment. I stood in the fluorescent light of the lobby and examined the envelope. The return address belonged to a regional bank based out of Ohio. It was not the lender that held the primary mortgage. I held the primary mortgage statement in my filing cabinet upstairs. This was a different institution entirely. The front of the envelope had a clear plastic window. Through the window, I could see my name printed beneath my mother's name. Above our names, printed in stark red ink, were the words, "Time-sensitive account matter." Below that, a smaller line of text referenced a home equity line of credit. My hands did not shake. I did not drop the mail. I felt a sudden, distinct chill, like stepping into a walk-in freezer. I am a compliance auditor. I spend my days tracking down misplaced decimal points and unauthorized billing codes. I know the anatomy of corporate correspondence. I know the difference between a solicitation and a warning. A promotional credit offer uses bulk rate postage. It features glossy paper and generalized language. This envelope utilized first-class certified postage. The paper was heavy stock. It bore a specific internal routing code often used by pre-collections departments. This was not an invitation to borrow money. This was a notification that money was already owed. I walked upstairs, unlocked my door, and placed my keys on the counter. I did not open the envelope. It felt like a live wire. Opening it would mean breaking a federal privacy law since it was technically addressed to my mother as the primary recipient, even though my name was listed as a secondary party. Instead, I picked up my phone and dialed her number. She answered on the 4th ring. In the background, I could hear the television broadcasting a cooking show. I heard the clinking of silverware. The sounds of a comfortable evening in a house I financed. I kept my voice neutral. I told her I received a piece of forwarded mail from an Ohio bank regarding a home equity line. I asked her what it was. Her response was immediate, smooth, and practiced. She did not hesitate. "Oh, it is just junk mail, sweetheart," she said. Her tone was light, dismissive, almost patronizing. "Greg handled a small tax issue for your father a few months ago. We had to file some paperwork. The banks just sell your data and send out these automated notices. Do not worry your head about it. Throw it in the recycling." She shifted the conversation smoothly, asking if I was coming to Sunday dinner, mentioning that Greg was trying a new recipe for smoked brisket. She painted over the warning flag with a thick coat of domestic normalcy. I told her I would throw it away. I ended the call. I stood in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the envelope on the counter. The obstacle in front of me was not physical. It was emotional. I wanted to believe her. More than anything, I wanted to accept the lie. Believing her meant I could go to sleep. It meant I could maintain the fragile peace I had purchased with 7 years of my salary. My boyfriend Mark came out of the bedroom. He had been staying with me for a few days. He manages a logistics center, coordinating freight schedules. He is a practical man who values order and hates unnecessary friction. He saw me staring at the counter. He asked what was wrong. I explained the letter and the phone call. I pointed out the postage class and the routing codes. Mark sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He told me to let it go. He said I was already carrying enough stress managing the primary mortgage. "You pay the main bill, Emily," he said. "That is your boundary. You keep a roof over your dad. Whatever Greg and your mom are doing with junk mail or tax forms is their problem. Do not go looking for ghosts. Digging into this is only going to cause a rift. You know how she gets. Just drop it." He was offering me an exit. He was giving me permission to look the other way. For 3 days, I tried to take his advice. Thursday, Friday, and Saturday passed in a blur of forced ignorance. I went to work. I audited hospital records. I went to the grocery store. I made dinner. But the envelope sat on my kitchen island, a silent monument to an unbalanced ledger. The anxiety manifested physically. My stomach felt hollow. I could not sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the red ink through the plastic window. I realized that my mother's explanation made 0 sense. A tax issue does not generate a joint home equity notice. Greg had no authority to handle tax issues for a property he did not own. The math was fundamentally flawed. By Sunday evening, the internal battle reached its breaking point. Mark was on the couch watching a baseball game. The apartment was quiet. I realized I could no longer play the role of the compliant, trusting daughter. That girl was a liability. I picked up my laptop and walked to the small dining table. I opened the browser. In the state of Pennsylvania, property deeds, mortgages, and liens are public records. They are recorded at the county level. Anyone with an internet connection and a few dollars for a search fee can access them. I navigated to the County Recorder of Deeds public portal. The website was outdated, featuring a gray interface and a clunky search matrix. I typed in the parcel number of my childhood home. I entered my mother's last name. As the blue loading bar crept across the screen, I felt a distinct shift in my own psychology. I was crossing a threshold. I was no longer a family member asking for clarification. I was an investigator, pulling the receipts. I waited for the digital ledger to open, knowing that whatever loaded on the next page would permanently alter the trajectory of my life. The county portal gave me a parcel number and a document code. It did not give me the scanned pages. To see the signatures, I had to physically go to the courthouse. Monday morning, I sent an email to my supervisor. I told him I had a family emergency. It was the truest statement I had typed in years. I drove to the county seat in Media. The records office is housed in a brutalist concrete building. It is a place where lives are reduced to paper. Divorces, bankruptcies, tax liens, and property deeds are all stored in identical filing cabinets. The air inside smelled of dust, ozone from the copy machines, and old floor wax. The lighting was a harsh, unforgiving fluorescent white. It is the kind of light that makes everyone look tired. I filled out a request slip with a dull golf pencil. I slid it under the glass to a clerk who did not look up from her monitor. 10 minutes later, she handed me a thick manila folder. I walked over to a scarred wooden table in the corner of the room. A microfiche machine hummed softly beside me. I opened the folder. The document was a deed of trust, a second mortgage. I looked at the principal amount. $150,000. I looked at the lender. It was the Ohio bank from the envelope. I looked at the date. The loan was originated 14 months ago. That was 6 months after Greg moved his monitors and his theories into my childhood bedroom. I turned to the final page to find the signature block. I expected to see a clumsy forgery. I expected to see my mother trying to copy the slant of my handwriting. What I saw was far worse, because it was legal. On a line above my printed name, my mother had signed her own name. Next to it, in neat blue ink, were the words, "Attorney in fact." She had attached a certified copy of the durable power of attorney, the same document she slid across the table 7 years ago when my father had his stroke. The document she promised was just a safety net for medical emergencies. I sat in the hard plastic chair and stared at the blue ink. The room around me faded into a dull roar. I am an auditor. I process data. I flipped to the loan application attached to the file. The income verification section listed my employer. It listed my exact annual salary. It listed the duration of my employment. Greg did not have a stable income. My mother had a destroyed credit score from years of medical debt. Neither of them could qualify for a small retail credit card, let alone a 6-figure home equity line. But I could. I had spent 7 years building a flawless credit history. I paid my bills on time. I had a low debt-to-income ratio. They used me. They packaged my financial identity and sold it to an underwriter in Ohio. I did not feel a sudden rush of rage. I felt a cold, expanding clarity. I began to piece together the timeline. 14 months ago, the cryptocurrency market experienced a massive correction. Values plummeted overnight. Greg had been trading on margin. He was borrowing money to amplify his trades. When the market crashed, his brokers would have issued margin calls. They demanded immediate liquidity to cover the losses, or they would liquidate his entire portfolio. He panicked. He went to my mother. I could picture the scene in the kitchen perfectly. Greg pacing the floor, sweating, explaining that he just needed a bridge loan. He would have told her the market was bound to rebound. He just needed capital to hold his position. If they did not get the money, he would lose everything he had built. My mother is terrified of failure, not just her own, but the failure of her golden child. Watching Greg fail meant admitting her own judgment was flawed. It meant acknowledging that she had displaced her steady, reliable daughter for a son who was selling smoke. She could not face that reality. So she authorized the loan. She convinced herself Greg was a genius who was just experiencing a temporary setback. She told herself he would pay it back in a few months, and I would never have to know. She justified the betrayal as a protective measure for the family. She did not do it to ruin me. She did it because she viewed my credit the same way she viewed my old bedroom. It was unused space. And Greg needed it. The math was undeniable. The betrayal was filed in triplicate, stamped with a notary seal, and recorded in the public ledger. They had doubled the debt on the house. If this secondary loan defaulted, the Ohio lender could initiate foreclosure, wiping out the primary mortgage I was paying, destroying my credit, and evicting my sick father. I sat at the wooden table for a full hour. I memorized the interest rates. I memorized the penalty clauses. I traced the raised seal on the final page with my finger. I took my phone out of my purse and calculated the monthly payments on a $150,000 loan at 8% interest. It was over $1,000 a month. A payment my unemployed brother and my financially ruined mother were supposed to be making. A payment the forwarded envelope proved they were already missing. I stood up. I walked back to the clerk. I paid $18 for certified copies of every single page in the folder. The copy machine thumped rhythmically as it printed my ruin on crisp white paper. I walked out of the courthouse and into the bright afternoon sun. The air was thick with humidity. I got into my car, put the key in the ignition, but I did not start the engine. I looked at the certified documents resting on a passenger seat. I had the proof. I had the ledger. But paperwork is just paper until it is presented to the people who signed it. The following Sunday was our regular family dinner. My mother expected me to arrive at 5 o'clock. She expected me to sit at the table, eat her food, and ask no questions. She expected the quiet, compliant daughter to maintain the illusion of peace. I started the engine. I pulled out of the parking lot. I knew I was going to Sunday dinner, but I was not going to eat. I was going to test the structural integrity of their lies. I needed to see how far they would go to defend a house that was already burning down. I drove to Chester County on Sunday afternoon. The weather was bright and clear, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of my parents' neighborhood. I pulled into the driveway at 10 minutes to 5. From the outside, the house looked perfect. The gutters were clean, the flower beds were framed with fresh, dark mulch. The bricks caught the late afternoon sun. It looked like a home built on a solid foundation. I turned off the engine and sat behind the steering wheel for a long time, knowing that the structure standing in front of me was a financial ghost. I unlocked the front door and walked inside. The temperature was set to a comfortable 72 degrees. The air smelled of roasted meat and rosemary. It was the scent of domestic stability, carefully manufactured to hide the rot underneath. I walked into the living room first. My father, Tom, was lying in his medical bed by the front window. The television was on, muted, showing a golf tournament. The mechanical hum of his oxygen concentrator provided a steady baseline rhythm to the room. I stood beside his bed and looked down at him. He was a man who had spent 3 decades organizing municipal supply chains. He believed in order. He believed in saving a portion of every paycheck. He was staring at the television screen, his left hand resting motionless on a plaid blanket. I touched his right shoulder. He turned his head slowly and offered a crooked, asymmetrical smile. I wondered if he knew. Deep down in the parts of his mind the stroke had not erased, I wondered if he understood that the roof over his head had been leveraged to 0. I squeezed his shoulder and walked toward the kitchen. My mother was standing by the stove, pulling a heavy roasting pan out of the oven. She wore a pristine white apron over a navy blue blouse. She looked like a magazine spread about graceful aging. She turned and greeted me with a brief, tight smile. She did not ask how my drive was. She did not ask about my week at the clinic. She handed me a stack of porcelain plates and told me to set the dining room table. I carried the plates into the dining room. I placed them on the polished mahogany table. Above me, I could hear the muffled thud of footsteps on the second floor. Greg was in my old bedroom. I heard the distinct, rapid clicking of his mechanical keyboard, the sound of a man pretending to be busy. A few minutes later, he came downstairs. He was wearing expensive gray athletic joggers and a fitted black t-shirt. He smelled of cedar and expensive cologne. He walked past me, grabbed a bottle of sparkling water from the refrigerator, and sat down at the table without saying a word. Dinner began with the usual shallow theater. My mother carved the roast. She passed the bowls of mashed potatoes and green beans. She directed the conversation towards safe, superficial topics. She talked about a neighbor replacing their fence. She talked about the rising cost of landscaping services. She spoke as if the ground beneath her chair was not currently sinking. I filled my plate. I picked up my fork. I did not take a bite. I looked across the table at the woman who had forged my signature to a $150,000 debt. I looked at the brother who had squandered the money on digital vapor. I decided to test the structural integrity of the illusion. I needed to see how hard they would fight to defend a lie. I placed my fork down on the porcelain plate. The metal made a sharp, distinct clink that cut through the silence. I cleared my throat. I kept my voice flat, devoid of any rising inflection. I told them my apartment lease was up for renewal at the end of the year. I said the management company was raising the rent by $300 a month. I said I was looking at my budget, and managing both my rent and the primary mortgage on this house was becoming mathematically impossible. The temperature in the room plummeted. The rhythmic sound of chewing stopped. I looked directly at my mother. I said I was thinking about letting my apartment go. I said it made the most financial sense for me to move back into this house. I said I would need my old bedroom back. The reaction was instantaneous. It was not a physical explosion. It was a rapid, calculated shift in defensive posture. My mother set her wine glass down on the table. She pressed her lips together until they formed a thin, colorless line. She did not address the math. She did not ask about my financial strain. She immediately pivoted to character assassination. She asked why I always insisted on creating friction. She asked why I chose Sunday dinner to bring up logistics. I did not let her change the subject. I kept my voice steady. I said the logistics are simple. I am paying $2,200 a month to keep this property out of foreclosure. If I am funding the asset, I should have access to the space. Greg can move his computers to the basement. My mother inhaled sharply. The mask of the graceful matriarch dropped, her eyes narrowed. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany wood. She lowered her voice, utilizing the insidious, quiet tone she reserved for inflicting maximum guilt. She said I had always been so rigid. She told me I had no concept of the pressures Greg was facing. She painted a picture of my brother as a tortured visionary, carrying the weight of the family future on his shoulders. She said Greg is actually trying to elevate this family, Emily. He is building a network. He is trying to create real wealth. You sit in a cubicle and look at spreadsheets. You have a paycheck, but he has a vision. Why do you always have to act like such a selfish failure when someone else is trying to succeed? I sat very still. I let the words hang in the air. Selfish failure. I was paying for the food on the table, the electricity powering the lights overhead, and the water flowing from the tap. Yet in her narrative, I was the parasite. I shifted my gaze to Greg. I wanted to see the visionary defending his empire. Greg was cutting a piece of roast beef. He methodically dragged his knife across the meat. He placed the bite in his mouth and chewed slowly. He stared at his plate. He did not look at me. He did not look at his mother. He let her absorb the conflict. He let her act as his human shield. He was a 34-year-old man, hiding behind his mother's apron strings, chewing food bought with his younger sister's money. I did not cry. My throat did not tighten. The emotional response I expected to feel was entirely absent. It was replaced by a clinical, devastating clarity. I looked at the bowls of food. I looked at the polished wood grain of the table. I looked through the archway into the living room, where the fading photographs of my father sat on the mantel. I realized I was not a daughter. I was never a daughter. I was a utility. I was the generator humming in the background, keeping the lights on so the real family could act out their play. They did not love me. They loved what my credit score provided. If I stopped working, the lights would go out, and they would discard me in the dark. I picked up my linen napkin. I folded it neatly into a square. I placed it on the table beside my untouched plate. I stood up. The wooden chair scraped against the hardwood floor. My mother stopped talking. She looked up at me, her face a mixture of defiance and sudden uncertainty. She asked where I was going. She pointed out that I had not finished my meal. I looked down at her. I told her I had lost my appetite. I walked out of the dining room. I walked past my father, his eyes still fixed on the silent television. I walked out the front door and closed it firmly behind me. I did not slam it. A slam implies a loss of control. I was taking control back. I got into my car. I started the engine. I drove away from Chester County as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The silence inside the cabin was heavy, thick with the realization that the family I thought I was saving had never really existed. The people sitting in that dining room were strangers who shared my last name. The drive home was dark. I knew the truth, and they knew I was a threat to their comfort. But knowing the math is not the same as surviving the collapse. On Monday morning, I needed to understand exactly how much damage the forged document had done to my legal standing. I needed someone who dealt in leverage, not emotion. I needed a lawyer. David Miller practiced real estate law in Westchester. He sat across from me, put on a pair of reading glasses, and opened the manila folder I handed him. I did not give him an emotional backstory. I am an auditor. I gave him the timeline, the primary loan documents, the power of attorney, and the certified copies of the secondary mortgage. David read in silence. He flipped back to the power of attorney and traced the notary stamp with his thumb. Then he took off his glasses and dropped them onto the desk. He leaned back in his chair and delivered the diagnosis with the blunt force of a surgeon explaining a terminal chart. He said you signed a blank check, Emily. They legally robbed you. I sat forward. I told him I never authorized the second loan. I said my mother abused the intent of the document. I asked him how we filed charges for fraud. David shook his head. He picked up his pen and tapped it against the desk. He explained the harsh machinery of Pennsylvania civil law. The document I signed 7 years ago was a durable power of attorney with broad financial authority. My mother did not forge my name. She signed as my legally appointed agent. Proving she acted outside my best interests required a civil lawsuit. David laid out the math. A lawsuit would take 2 to 3 years to wind through the county docket. He would need a $10,000 retainer just to file the initial motions. We would have to depose my mother. We would have to depose the bank officers in Ohio. Meanwhile, the clock on the debt would keep ticking. I did not have $10,000 for a retainer. My savings were depleted from paying the primary mortgage. They had drained my resources to the point where I could not even afford the sword to fight them. David saw the realization settle over me. He leaned forward and outlined the trap. The primary mortgage was in my name. The secondary loan was anchored to the same property. If my mother and Greg defaulted on the Ohio loan, that bank would initiate foreclosure to recover their funds. When a secondary lender forecloses, the primary lender is automatically triggered to protect their first position lien. The house would be seized. The property would be sold at a sheriff auction. If the sale price did not cover the combined debt, the banks would file a deficiency judgment. Because my name was on the primary note, they would come after my wages. My credit score, the only pristine asset I had left, would be annihilated. I asked him what my options were. I asked him how I extract myself from a burning building. David looked out the window at the parking lot. He said, "There is no clean exit. There is only the nuclear option." He told me I had to stop paying the primary mortgage. I stared at him. For 7 years, making that payment was the central organizing principle of my life. It was the monthly ritual that kept my father safe. David explained the strategy. Right now, I was bleeding out slowly. By continuing to pay the primary loan, I was keeping the asset afloat while they let the secondary loan sink it. I had to force the collapse on my own terms. If I stopped paying, the primary lender would initiate the foreclosure process much faster. When the bank filed the civil complaint, I could use my 84 wire transfer receipts. I could present a meticulously documented audit proving I had satisfied my proportional equity contribution. I could not save the house, but I could force the bank to aim their collection efforts entirely at the property itself and the co-signers who initiated the secondary debt. I could legally sever my liability, but the cost was devastating. David did not sugarcoat the fallout. Letting the primary mortgage default meant my credit would be destroyed for 7 years. I would not be able to buy a car. I would not be able to rent a decent apartment. I would be financially radioactive. And then he brought up the human collateral. He asked about my father. If I stopped paying, the bank would take the house in 6 months. My father, a man paralyzed by a stroke, would be evicted by county sheriffs. My mother and brother would have nowhere to put him. He would become a ward of the state, placed in a Medicare-funded nursing facility. I sat in the leather chair, feeling the oxygen thin out in the room. I had come looking for a legal loophole. Instead, I was handed a match and told to burn my own house down. I had to choose between my own financial survival and my father's physical comfort. It was a harrowing moral dilemma. If I kept paying, the Ohio bank would eventually foreclose anyway, ruining me and rendering my father homeless a year from now. If I pulled the plug today, I accelerated his eviction, but saved myself from wage garnishment and total bankruptcy. David watched me process the reality. He told me to go home. He told me not to make a decision while the wound was still fresh. He said I needed to gather all my bank statements and prepare myself for a very long, cold winter. I thanked him. I paid him for his hour. I walked out of the brick building and got into my sedan. The legal mechanics were clear, but a piece of the puzzle was still missing. I needed to understand the velocity of the destruction. $150,000 is a massive amount of capital. It takes time to burn through that much money on living expenses. But the Ohio bank was already sending pre-collections notices. That meant the money was gone. Before I could commit to destroying my credit and evicting my sick father, I needed to know exactly where the capital went. I needed to look at the math behind Greg's phantom empire. I drove back to my apartment, opened my laptop, and began tracing the digital footprints of a man who traded real brick and mortar for invisible coins. I returned to my apartment. The air inside felt thin and stale. I placed my keys on the counter and opened my laptop. The screen illuminated the dark kitchen. $150,000 is a heavy amount of capital. People do not lose that kind of money overnight by accident. They lose it through a series of escalating mistakes. I needed to map those mistakes. I needed to see the math. I am an auditor. I track digital footprints for a living. Healthcare billing codes leave a trail. Digital currency is no different. The blockchain is a public ledger. Every transaction is permanent and visible to anyone who knows how to look. 6 months ago, Greg sent me a text message containing a link to a decentralized exchange. He wanted to show me a public wallet address to prove how much profit he was generating. He wanted me to invest my savings. I declined. But the text message was still in my phone history. I typed his wallet address into a block explorer. The data loaded. I scrolled back 14 months to the exact week the secondary mortgage was recorded in Delaware County. I found the entry point. A deposit of $150,000 hit his account on a Thursday afternoon. By Friday morning, the capital was gone from the primary wallet. He did not buy a sports car. He did not buy luxury watches or book a vacation to Europe. He moved the funds to a high-risk trading protocol. Greg was not investing. He was gambling. He used the house money as collateral to borrow even more digital currency. It is a process called trading on margin. If the market goes up, the profits multiply. If the market goes down, the broker demands more collateral. If you cannot pay, they liquidate your position. They take everything to cover the debt. I read the timestamps. I could see his panic coded into the ledger. The digital assets he bought started bleeding value in late November. A smart trader takes the loss and walks away. Greg was terrified. At 2 a.m, he initiated another trade. He moved the last remaining chunk of the loan to double down on a failing position. He believed he could force a win. He was trying to earn back the initial losses before my mother noticed the money was gone. At 4:15 a.m, the algorithm triggered a margin call. 3 minutes later, the account was liquidated. The balance went to zero. I sat back in my chair. The realization shifted my perspective of the enemy. Greg is not a mastermind. He is a coward. I pictured him sitting in my old bedroom, the blackout curtains drawn, the curved monitors glowing in the dark. He watched $250,000 of family equity vanish in the span of 3 minutes. He must have felt the floor drop out from under him. He must have sweat through his shirt. And then he had to walk downstairs and eat breakfast with our mother. I thought back to last Thanksgiving. It was 2 weeks after the ledger showed the account going to zero. We were sitting around the dining room table. My father was in his bed by the window. Greg was carving the turkey. He gave a toast about financial independence. He looked me in the eye and said some people build equity and some people just pay rent. I remembered the smug tilt of his chin. I remembered my mother smiling at him with blind adoration. At the time, I felt small. Now, looking at the digital timestamp of his ruin, I realized he delivered that speech knowing his net worth was a negative number. The arrogance was a defense mechanism. It was a shield made of glass. My mother had to know. The Ohio bank sent warning letters to the house long before the forwarded notice reached my apartment. She intercepted them. She hid them in the bottom of her purse, but she did not confront him. Confronting him meant admitting she had bankrolled a failure. It meant acknowledging she had handed the keys to the castle to a son who immediately drove it off a cliff. So they built a shared delusion. Greg kept ordering ergonomic chairs and drinking expensive cold brew coffee. He kept talking about market rebounds at Sunday dinner. My mother kept pouring his wine. They were living inside a performance. They maintained the aesthetic of wealth while the foundation crumbled beneath their feet. Understanding their psychology was the final piece of the audit. You cannot reason with people who are operating out of pure survival panic. They were drowning. I was standing on the dock. If I reached out my hand to save them, they would not pull themselves up. They would pull me under. They needed my pristine credit to survive. They needed my monthly primary mortgage payment to keep the sheriff away for just a little longer. They were willing to let me sink to buy themselves another month of pretending. This is the danger of misplaced loyalty. I had spent my adult life trying to earn a seat at a table purchased with stolen funds. I wanted my mother to see me as capable and valuable, but the ledger showed the objective truth. To her, my value was measured only by my utility. I was a signature on a loan application. I was an automated transfer on the first of every month. I was the silent partner in a firm that had already declared moral bankruptcy. I sat in the quiet of my apartment. The radiator clinked against the wall. The streetlights outside cast a yellow glow across the linoleum floor. I did not feel angry. Anger makes you reckless. I felt a cold, calculated stillness, the kind of stillness that settles over a surgical theater right before the first incision. My father was the collateral damage. That was the stone I had to swallow. By cutting the cord, I was accelerating his removal from the house. But the ledger proved the house was already lost. The Ohio Bank owned the equity. The crypto market owned the capital. The only thing left was the illusion. And I refused to finance the illusion any longer. The time for asking questions was over. The time for action had arrived. I closed the Blockchain Explorer. I opened a new tab. I navigated to my primary banking portal. I had a monthly recurring transfer scheduled for the next week, $2,200. It was the tether that bound me to their sinking ship. I moved my cursor over the cancellation button. The screen of my laptop glowed against the dark kitchen counter. I was logged into the portal of my credit union. The scheduled transfers page was open. Line item 4 was the primary mortgage payment, $2,200, set to deploy in 48 hours. My index finger rested on the trackpad. I am a person who builds safety nets. I do not tear them down. Pressing delete meant abandoning the core function I had served for 7 years. It meant stepping off the edge of a cliff and taking the entire structure down with me. I watched the cursor blink. I thought about the ledger. I thought about the $150,000 evaporating in the middle of the night while my brother stared at his monitors. I pressed down. The trackpad clicked. A confirmation dialog box appeared on the screen, asking if I was sure I wanted to cancel this recurring series. I clicked yes. The line item vanished. The ledger rebalanced. My checking account retained the capital, but the psychological weight of that missing line item felt heavier than the debt itself. I had just pulled the pin on a grenade and rolled it under the foundation of my childhood home. The next afternoon, I drove back to Chester County. I did not park in the driveway. I left my sedan on the street a block away. I used my original key to unlock the front door. The house was quiet. Greg was out, probably meeting with other so-called visionaries who traded imaginary assets. My mother was at the grocery store. I knew her weekly schedule. I planned this visit for the specific window of time when I could be alone with the one person who stood to lose everything in the crossfire. My father was lying in his medical bed by the front window. The afternoon sun slanted through the horizontal blinds, casting parallel shadows across his pale blue blanket. The oxygen machine hummed its steady mechanical rhythm. I pulled a wooden chair up to the side of his mattress. I sat down. He turned his head slowly. The stroke had paralyzed the left side of his body and stolen his ability to string together complex sentences, but his eyes were clear. He looked at me and offered a small asymmetrical smile. He recognized his daughter. He did not recognize the architect of his impending eviction. I reached out and took his right hand. His skin felt like old parchment paper. His knuckles were swollen from arthritis. This was the man who taught me how to balance a checkbook when I was 12 years old. He kept meticulous records of his pension. He did everything right his entire life, only to be sidelined by a blood clot, leaving his legacy in the hands of a wife who panicked and a son who gambled. I sat there holding his hand. I did not speak. I could not tell him the bank was coming. I could not explain that letting a foreclosure agent put a padlock on his front door was the only way to save myself from total ruin. I sat with him for an hour, listening to the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen concentrator. I squeezed his hand one last time, stood up, and walked out the door before my mother returned. I made it to my sedan parked down the street before the physical toll hit me. My hands were shaking so violently I could not get the key into the ignition. The metal scraped against the plastic steering column. I dropped the keys on the floorboard, leaned forward, and pressed my forehead against the cold steering wheel. I dry heaved until my ribs ached. The guilt was a physical weight crushing my lungs. I sat there gasping for air in the quiet car. Then I closed my eyes, took a long breath, and locked the emotion away in a mental vault. I picked up the keys. I put the auditor mask back on. I started the engine and drove away. Back in my apartment, I shifted from daughter back to auditor. I cleared off my dining room table. I needed to construct the mechanism of my defense. In Pennsylvania, a bank cannot just take a house overnight. There is a rigid legal framework designed to process failure. After 60 days of non-payment, the lender is required by state law to issue an Act 91 notice. It is a formal declaration of intention to foreclose. It gives the homeowner 30 days to cure the default. After 90 days, the civil complaint is formally filed with the county court. I opened a calendar application on my laptop. I counted the days forward from the missed payment. I circled a specific week in late October. The math was precise. The timeline was set. I walked to my hall closet and pulled out a heavy-duty 3-ring binder. It was 3 inches thick and covered in black vinyl. I bought a pack of numbered indexing tabs. I started printing. I printed all 84 wire transfer confirmations detailing every single month I paid the primary mortgage from my personal checking account. I printed my tax returns. I printed the county records showing the forged power of attorney. I printed the blockchain ledger proving my brother lost the secondary loan funds. I hole-punched every single page. I sorted them by date, by relevance, by financial weight. I built a physical manifestation of the truth. I felt the heavy snap of the metal rings closing over the paper. When the sheriff finally served the papers, I would not offer an emotional defense. I would hand the judge a verified audit proving I met my obligations while the co-signers robbed the equity. The first missed payment triggered a late fee. The bank sent an automated email to my inbox. I archived it. By the second week, my mother started calling. She noticed the money had not cleared the primary account. The caller ID flashed her name on my phone screen. I let it ring. She left a voicemail asking if there was a glitch with the bank transfer. Her tone was light and casual, masking the rising panic I knew she felt. 2 days later, she called again. The tone shifted. It was sharper and more demanding. She told me to call her back immediately. I deleted the message. I retreated into a state of hyper-focused, quiet isolation. I went to work. I audited medical files. I came home. I reviewed the binder. I did not answer her texts. I did not attend Sunday dinner. I cut the communication lines. Let them wonder. Let them check the mail every day, hoping the check was just delayed in processing. Let them sit in the house I used to pay for, feeling the walls slowly close in around them. The trap was mathematically set. The fuse was lit and burning down to the wire. But I knew my mother. I knew how she handled the threat of exposure. Instead of preparing for the crash, she would try to paint over the cracks. She would double down on the performance of a perfect life, oblivious to the fact that the bank was already drafting the final act. 60 days passed. In the financial sector, 60 days is a critical marker. It is the boundary line between a temporary oversight and a structural default. On day 60, the automated systems of a lending institution trigger a cascading series of legal protocols. The bank printed the Act 91 notice. It is a formal declaration of impending foreclosure required by Pennsylvania law. They placed it in a certified envelope and mailed it to the Chester County address. I knew exactly when that letter arrived. I tracked the Postal Service delivery confirmation online. The mail carrier placed it in the black metal box at the end of their driveway on a Thursday morning. My mother ignored it. She treated the certified notice the same way she treated the forwarded home equity warnings. She placed it in a drawer or at the bottom of a handbag. The psychology of denial is a fascinating mechanism. When a person is confronted with a reality that shatters their self-image, they do not analyze the threat. They build a wall to block it out. My mother built her wall out of heavy cardstock and gold foil lettering. The invitation arrived at my apartment on a Tuesday. I found it sitting on my kitchen counter. The envelope was thick eggshell white paper lined with silver. I slid my thumb under the seal and pulled out the card. The elegant cursive font announced a celebration. Susan and Tom Louisa cordially invite you to celebrate 35 years of marriage. The event was scheduled for the third weekend in October. A catered afternoon reception held beneath a grand tent in the backyard of the Chester County residence. I held the invitation under the kitchen light. The disconnect between the physical object in my hand and the digital ledger on my computer was staggering. They were 30 days away from a sheriff standing on their front porch with an eviction order. Yet my mother was hiring a catering company. She was throwing a party to celebrate a legacy that she had already secretly dismantled and sold. Greg was actively encouraging the spectacle. I knew this because he started posting updates on his social media profiles. He shared pictures of floral arrangements and rented tables. He wrote captions about honoring family traditions and rewarding hard work. He needed the neighborhood to see the party. He needed his peers to walk into that backyard and see the illusion of sustained wealth. If he could convince the neighbors he was successful, he could keep convincing himself. They were two people standing on the deck of a sinking ship arguing over the color of the napkins. I decided to attend the initial planning brunch. I did not go to help. I went to observe the structural integrity of their delusion. I needed to see if they showed any microscopic signs of panic. We met at a small upscale cafe in Westchester. The restaurant smelled of roasted espresso beans and fresh sourdough. My mother secured a corner booth. She wore a tailored beige blazer and a silk scarf. She looked radiant. The hollow exhaustion I saw in her eyes a year ago was gone. It was replaced by a manic, high-voltage energy. Greg sat across from her, drinking a flat white and scrolling through his phone. I sat down and ordered black coffee. My mother immediately spread a leather-bound planner across the wooden table. The pages were filled with fabric swatches and catering menus. She did not ask why I had stopped answering her calls. She did not mention the missed mortgage payments. She simply assumed my silence was my typical stubbornness returning to a baseline. In her mind, I was just throwing a quiet tantrum. The reality of the missing funds had not penetrated her shield of denial. She began listing the expenses with a bizarre sense of pride. She talked about the lemon herb chicken point cost. She detailed the price of the cedar wood smoke machines for the outdoor lounge area. She complained about the hidden delivery fees for the high-peak marquee tent. She was financing the entire production on a series of maxed-out retail credit cards. She was borrowing money at 24% interest to buy flowers for a house she no longer owned. I watched her trace a French manicured fingernail down the column of numbers. I took a sip of my coffee. The liquid was hot and bitter. I remained silent, waiting for the inevitable pivot. The pivot always comes when the funds run dry. She tapped her pen against the edge of the planner. She sighed deeply, letting her shoulders drop to project an image of noble fatigue. She looked at me over the rim of her reading glasses. She said the floral centerpieces are turning out to be much higher than the initial estimate, Emily. The florist is charging a premium for the imported white hydrangeas. I set my coffee cup down on the saucer. I did not offer a solution. She leaned forward slightly. She lowered her voice, attempting to create a false sense of intimacy. She said, "I know you have been distant lately, but this milestone is important. It is for your father, Emily. He deserves a beautiful day. I was hoping you might want to sponsor the floral arrangements. Just a small contribution to show him you care." There it was, the weaponization of my paralyzed father. She used his illness as a crowbar to pry open my wallet. 6 months ago, that request would have worked. 6 months ago, I would have felt the familiar crush of guilt. I would have pulled out my debit card to prove my loyalty. I looked at the fabric swatches on the table. I looked at Greg, who was pretending not to listen while casually adjusting the collar of his expensive shirt. I looked back at my mother. I kept my voice even and quiet, the tone of an auditor verifying a balance sheet. I said, "My contributions are fully documented, Mom." She blinked. The subtext sailed directly over her head. She did not hear a warning. She only heard a refusal. Her jaw tightened. The brief flash of maternal warmth vanished instantly. She snapped the leather planner shut. She said, "Fine." She said she would handle it herself, just like she always did. She muttered something under her breath about how some people just refuse to participate in joy. The brunch ended shortly after that. Greg paid the bill with a heavy metal credit card that I knew carried a balance he could never repay. We walked out to the parking lot in silence. The air was crisp, hinting at the approaching autumn. I watched them get into her SUV. They drove away, planning a celebration of their own ruin. I got into my sedan and gripped the steering wheel. The tension in my chest was heavy. The audience was seated. The actors were on the stage. The props were paid for with phantom money. They had built a beautiful, elaborate set, but they forgot to pay the rent on the theater. They thought they had outsmarted the system. They thought ignoring the mail made the debt disappear. But lending institutions do not run on emotion. They run on automated algorithms and rigid legal deadlines. The bank gave them 60 days of paper warnings. The paper warnings were about to stop. The countdown clock was entering its final phase. I knew that by day 85, the automated system would escalate the protocol. The bank would bypass the mailbox and seek direct human contact. The silence of the past 2 months was just the water pulling back from the shore. The wave was building, and I was the only person who knew exactly when it was going to break. Day 85 arrived on a Thursday. The morning was unseasonably cold. Frost coated the windshield of my sedan when I left for work. The leaves on the oak trees outside my office window were turning brittle and brown, ready to detach and fall. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a quarterly compliance report for a regional cardiology clinic. The spreadsheets on my monitor were clean and balanced. The columns aligned perfectly. My professional life was a sanctuary of order. My personal life was a demolition site. My cell phone vibrated against the laminate wood of my desk. I looked at the screen. The caller ID displayed a toll-free number. I recognized the prefix. It belonged to the loss mitigation department of the institution that held the primary mortgage on the Chester County property. For nearly 3 months, they had relied on automated systems. They sent letters. They generated emails. They waited for a response that never came. The grace period had finally expired. The algorithm determined that postage was no longer sufficient. It was time for human intervention. I did not pause. I picked up the phone and pressed the green icon to accept the call. A woman spoke. Her name was Brenda. Her voice carried the specific hollow fatigue of someone who spends 8 hours a day speaking to desperate people. She asked for Emily Louisa. I verified my identity, confirming the last 4 digits of my social security number and my date of birth. Brenda read a scripted legal disclosure regarding the recording of the conversation. Then she transitioned to the primary issue. She informed me that the mortgage account was 85 days in arrears. The balance required to cure the default was approaching $8,000, including late fees and accrued interest. She asked if I was experiencing an unexpected financial hardship. She asked if I wanted to discuss a forbearance plan or a loan modification. She offered me a lifeline. She expected me to take it. She expected tears, bargaining, or a panicked explanation about medical bills and family emergencies. I provided none of those things. I kept my voice flat, maintaining the clinical tone I use when discussing a miscoded insurance claim. I told Brenda I was not experiencing a hardship. I told her I was intentionally ceasing all future payments on the account. There was a distinct pause on the line. The rhythm of her script was broken. She was accustomed to homeowners fighting tooth and nail to save their properties. She was not accustomed to a guarantor calmly confirming a default. She recovered and read the next mandatory warning. She explained that continued non-payment would result in the acceleration of the debt. The bank would demand the full principal balance immediately. Failure to pay would trigger formal foreclosure proceedings. She warned me that my credit score would suffer severe damage. I let her finish. I told her I understood the consequences. I acknowledged the debt acceleration. Then, I shifted the trajectory of the strike. I informed Brenda that, while my name was on the loan, I did not reside at the mortgaged property. I provided my current apartment address for all future paper correspondence regarding my personal liability. Then, I gave her the physical address of the Chester County house. I provided the legal names of the current occupants, Susan Louisa, Greg Louisa. I instructed her to update the file. I stated clearly that any physical service of legal documents, including the upcoming civil complaint, must be executed at the Chester County address where the residents were located. Brenda typed. The sharp clacking of her keyboard echoed through the receiver. It sounded like nails being driven into a coffin. I had one more procedural item to address. I told Brenda I was formally revoking any power of attorney privileges associated with my name regarding this account, or any secondary liens attached to the property. I requested she place a hard lock on the file, preventing anyone claiming to act as my agent from making alterations, requesting forbearance, or accessing the ledger. She confirmed the request. The lock was placed. The gates were closed. In Pennsylvania, a bank cannot just seize a house and change the locks. Foreclosure is a judicial process. The lender must file a formal lawsuit in the County Court of Common Pleas. Once the civil complaint is filed, the court issues a summons. The bank must hire a third-party process server to hand-deliver the lawsuit to the defendants. I asked Brenda for the estimated timeline. I needed to know the velocity of the legal machinery. She reviewed her screen. She said the file was being transferred to local counsel by the end of the business day. The attorneys would draft the complaint. She stated that physical service typically occurs within 7 to 10 business days from the transfer. I thanked her for her time. I disconnected the call. I looked at the paper calendar sitting on my desk. I traced my index finger across the grid, counting the days forward. 7 to 10 business days. My finger stopped on a Friday. The window for service extended through the weekend. It landed precisely on the third weekend of October. My mother had rented a high-peak tent. She hired a caterer. She invited 60 people to stand in her backyard and celebrate 35 years of marriage. She was planning to showcase her pristine life to the neighborhood. The collision of these two events was not orchestrated by me. I did not pick the date the bank decided to call. I did not schedule the anniversary party. The timing was the natural, devastating result of mathematical inevitability. The bank algorithms operate on a blind schedule. They do not care about floral arrangements, catered chicken, or social standing. They only care about the ledger. I opened the blank document on my computer. I typed a final summary page. I documented the exact date and time of the phone call. I recorded Brenda's name. I noted the confirmation of the foreclosure initiation and the formal revocation of the power of attorney. I pressed print. The laser printer in the corner of my office whirred to life. I walked over and picked up the warm sheet of paper. I took a 3-hole punch, pressed down on the metal lever, and aligned the page behind the final index tab of my black vinyl binder. I closed the heavy covers. The metal rings snapped shut. The audit was complete. People who watch movies think retribution feels triumphant. They imagine a surge of adrenaline, a victorious soundtrack playing in the background. They think destroying an enemy brings joy. I sat back in my desk chair and looked at the black binder. I did not feel triumphant. I felt a hollow, scraped-out emptiness in my chest. This was not a victory. It was an amputation. I was cutting off an infected limb to stop the rot from reaching my heart. The process saved my life, but it meant I would walk with a limp forever. I thought about my father, lying in his medical bed by the front window, watching the television. He had no idea that the machinery designed to evict him had just been activated. He was innocent collateral damage in a war he did not even know was being fought. The weight of that reality pressed down on me. The cost of my survival was his sanctuary. I placed the binder into my leather tote bag. I zipped it shut. The storm was no longer a dark cloud gathering on the horizon. It had made landfall. The legal gears were turning, grinding forward with mindless precision. The only thing left to do was put on a dress, walk into that rented tent, and wait for the stranger in the cheap suit to walk up the driveway. The third Saturday in October was sharp and cloudless. I arrived at the Chester County house at 2 in the afternoon. The neighborhood street was lined with luxury sport utility vehicles and imported German sedans. I parked my 10-year-old car 3 blocks away and walked the rest of the distance. The air was crisp. I could smell the imported cedarwood smoke before I even reached the driveway. My mother had rented industrial smoke machines to give the outdoor lounge area a rustic autumnal atmosphere. It was a cosmetic detail that cost $400 a day, charged to a retail card carrying a 24% interest rate. I walked through the side gate. The backyard was unrecognizable. A massive, high-peak canvas tent dominated the lawn. Strings of warm yellow Edison bulbs crisscrossed the ceiling, casting a golden hue over the grass. 6 portable propane heaters hummed softly in the corners, fighting off the October chill. Waitstaff wearing crisp black vests carried silver trays of hors d'oeuvres. The air carried the heavy, rich scent of catered lemon herb chicken and roasted rosemary potatoes. It was a flawless execution of suburban royalty. I wore a charcoal gray dress. It was unadorned, practical, the kind of garment you wear to sit in a deposition room. Over my right shoulder, I carried a dark leather tote bag. It was heavy. It contained the black vinyl binder, 3 inches of paper, 84 wire transfer receipts, the county deed records, the Block Explorer printouts mapping the crypto losses. The metal strap hardware dug into my collarbone. It was a physical reminder of the gravity I was carrying into a room built entirely on air. I moved through the crowd like a ghost. I did not want to speak to anyone, and frankly, no one was eager to speak to me. I am the quiet sister, the medical auditor, the boring, reliable utility. I nodded to an aunt visiting from New Jersey. I smiled briefly at a neighbor who asked a polite question about the hospital where I work. I gave short, closed answers. I did not hold a drink. I needed my hands free and my mind sharp. Near the rented mahogany bar, my brother was holding court. Greg wore a navy blue tailored suit that fit him perfectly. He held a crystal rocks glass filled with amber bourbon and a single oversized square ice cube. He was surrounded by 3 men from the neighborhood, men who managed regional sales teams or ran local dental practices. Greg was speaking with the rhythmic cadence of a seasoned financial executive. I drifted close enough to hear his vocabulary. He was throwing out terms like blockchain liquidity, decentralized market positioning, and algorithmic yield generation. He was explaining how traditional banking structures were obsolete, waving his hand to dismiss the very financial system that was currently hunting him. The ice clinked against his glass. The men around him nodded, impressed by his posture and his confidence. They saw a visionary ahead of the curve. I saw a man who had lost $150,000 of stolen family equity in a single night of panicked margin calls. I watched him take a sip of his bourbon. He looked remarkably comfortable inside his own lie. Across the lawn, my mother was playing the glowing matriarch. She wore a tailored ivory silk suit. A string of real pearls rested against her collarbone. She held a flute of champagne, moving seamlessly from table to table, touching elbows, laughing at polite jokes. She looked vibrant and alive. She was introducing my father's former colleagues to the lavish floral arrangements, pointing out the imported white hydrangeas she had complained about at the planning brunch. My father was not outside. He was inside the house, confined to his medical bed by the front window, likely watching a muted television screen. He was isolated from the celebration of his own legacy. The party was not for him. The party was a broadcast, a signal sent to the local zip code to prove that the Louisa family remained financially relevant and socially secure. At one point, my mother made eye contact with me across the width of the tent. The smile remained fixed on her face, but her eyes hardened for a fraction of a second. She offered a small, dismissive wave, a gesture designed to acknowledge my presence without inviting my company. I was a prop, standing in her peripheral vision. I nodded back. I did not look away until she did. I found a quiet spot near the back edge of the canvas tent, standing next to one of the propane heaters. The heat radiated against my legs. I simply waited. I became a human sensor, absorbing the specific frequency of the room. The sensory details amplified as the afternoon progressed. The sharp pop of a wine cork, the soft rustle of silk dresses brushing against chair legs, the low, rumbling laughter of my uncle from Ohio, the smell of expensive perfume mixing with the burning cedar wood. Every sound, every scent, every smile was financed by theft. I stood there, auditing the event in real time. The premium linens cost $800. The catering staff cost $3,000. The tent rental was another $2,000. They were dancing on a floor made of unpaid debts, celebrating an estate that legally belonged to a bank in Ohio. I looked down at my wrist. The leather band of my watch was worn at the edges. The metal hands showed 3:45 in the afternoon. The civil court system of Pennsylvania does not operate on an exact minute-by-minute schedule, but process servers are methodical. They are paid to deliver bad news, and they prefer to strike when the target is guaranteed to be at the listed address. A Saturday afternoon during a publicized residential event is a tactical certainty. I shifted my gaze past the edge of the tent, looking down the long asphalt driveway toward the street. The suburban road was lined with the glossy vehicles of the invited guests. The afternoon sun was beginning to drop lower in the sky, casting long, stretching shadows across the pavement. The narrative inside my head began to slow down to a crawl. The rhythm of the jazz music playing through the rented speakers seemed to fade away into a low, indistinct hum. The laughter of the crowd became background static. A vehicle turned the corner onto our street. It was not a luxury sport utility vehicle. It was not an imported sports car. It was a nondescript silver four-door sedan. It had dull paint and steel wheels lacking hubcaps. It was the kind of car designed to blend into any background, driven by a man whose entire job requires him to be ignored until it is too late. The silver sedan rolled slowly past the line of expensive parked cars. It came to a smooth stop directly in front of the iron gate marking our driveway. The engine idled. A faint puff of exhaust rose into the crisp autumn air. I felt my heart rate steady. The hollow feeling in my chest expanded, turning into a cold, clinical focus. I reached down and gripped the heavy leather strap of my tote bag. The driver's side door opened. A man stepped out onto the curb. He wore a cheap, off-the-rack brown suit. The shoulders were slightly too wide, the fabric stiff and synthetic. He did not look at the expensive cars. He did not look at the pristine landscaping or the massive white tent. He reached back into the front seat of the sedan and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. He shut the car door. The metallic thud echoed faintly up the driveway, cutting through the jazz music. He adjusted his tie, looked at the brass address numbers bolted to the stone pillar by the gate, and began to walk up the incline. The collision was no longer theoretical. The abstract math of the ledger had finally manifested into a physical human being carrying the weight of the law. The clock had run out. I watched him walk toward the tent, bringing the harsh reality of the outside world directly into the center of my mother's perfect illusion. The man in the brown suit walked up the asphalt driveway. His shoes had thick rubber soles that did not belong at a high-end garden party. He carried no gift. He carried a thick manila envelope tucked under his left arm. The catering staff rushing between the parked vehicles assumed he was a late vendor, perhaps someone arriving to check a municipal permit for the high-peak tent. They stepped out of his way without asking questions, but his posture was entirely different from a man delivering supplies. He walked with the heavy, unbothered stride of someone who gets paid a flat rate per delivery, regardless of the audience. He was an agent of the county court. He was immune to the display of wealth. He bypassed the iron gate and stepped onto the manicured grass. He did not pause to admire the imported white hydrangeas or the elaborate cedar wood smoke machines. He scanned the crowd. He was looking for a specific face to match the printed photograph clipped to the inside of his folder. My mother was standing near the center support pole of the canvas tent. She was surrounded by 3 couples from the neighborhood, people she had spent 2 decades trying to impress. She was holding a crystal flute filled with champagne. The afternoon sun caught the edge of the glass, casting a small prism of light against the lapel of her ivory silk suit. She was mid-toast. I could hear the cadence of her voice rising above the low hum of the portable heaters. She was speaking about enduring love. She was talking about weathering storms and building a foundation that lasts for generations. The irony of her words was a physical weight in the air. The process server navigated around the silver tray of roasted potatoes resting on a high-top table. He did not offer apologies as he brushed past the guests. He simply moved forward in a straight line until he breached the inner circle of my mother's audience. He stopped 3 feet away from her. The neighbors quieted down. The sudden presence of a stranger wearing cheap synthetic fabric disrupted the aesthetic of the gathering. They looked at him with mild confusion, expecting a punchline or a special delivery telegram. The man looked at my mother. He looked down at his hidden photograph, then looked back up at her face. He stated her full name. Susan Louisa. He did not phrase it as a question. It was a cold verification of identity. My mother smiled, She lowered her champagne flute, adopting the gracious, patient tone she always reserved for hired help. She confirmed her identity, nodding slightly, waiting to see what this man wanted. The process server reached into his folder. He pulled out a thick stack of heavy bond paper. The top left corner was secured with a heavy-duty industrial staple. He extended his right hand and pressed the documents directly into her free hand. He did not offer congratulations. He did not smile. He delivered the required legal phrase with the monotone exhaustion of a man who had already served 3 other evictions that morning. He told her she had been served. He did not wait for a response. His contractual obligation was fulfilled the moment the paper touched her skin. He turned his back on the 35-year anniversary party, walked back across the grass, walked down the long driveway, and got into his silver sedan. My mother stood perfectly still. She held the stack of paper with her left hand, her right hand still gripping the crystal flute. The documents were not protected by a privacy envelope. The state of Pennsylvania does not hide the mechanics of financial ruin. The text at the top of the first page was printed in bold, heavy black ink. Civil complaint in mortgage foreclosure. The jazz music playing through the rented speakers did not stop. The caterers on the other side of the lawn kept pouring wine into empty glasses. But the immediate radius around my mother went entirely dead. The 3 couples standing with her stopped smiling. They saw the blue county stamp. They saw the bold black letters. The human instinct to avoid the blast radius of bad news took over. One of the neighbors took a slow, deliberate step backward. I watched the blood drain from my mother's face. The ivory silk suit suddenly looked like a hospital gown. The manic, high-voltage energy that had fueled her for the past 2 months vanished in a single second. The shield of denial cracked and shattered on the grass. The bank was no longer a piece of junk mail she could hide in the bottom of her purse. The bank was standing in her backyard. She looked up. Her eyes darted around the tent in a frantic search for rescue. She sought out Greg. My brother was still standing near the mahogany bar. He had watched the entire exchange. The crystal rocks glass filled with bourbon was stopped halfway to his mouth. The arrogant posture, the tailored suit, the confident theories about decentralized wealth, all of it dissolved. He knew exactly what that stack of paper meant. He knew the Ohio lender had finally pulled the trigger on the $150,000 debt he lost in the dark. He did not step forward to defend his mother. He did not intervene. He physically shrank against the edge of the bar, looking like a terrified child. Fear requires a target. My mother could not process the shame of her wealthy neighbors watching her hold an eviction notice. She could not accept the public collapse of her legacy. Her psychology demanded a scapegoat. She needed someone to blame to maintain her own innocence. She scanned the crowd frantically. Her eyes swept past the ice sculptures, past the confused aunts and uncles, until they locked onto me standing quietly in the back corner by the propane heater. The instinct to deflect was immediate and vicious. She weaponized her panic. She called out my name. Her voice was sharp and loud, cutting straight through the jazz music. People turned their heads. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. "Emily!" she yelled. "What is this? There is a mistake with your payments." She threw the accusation across the lawn. She used her fear as a spotlight, trying to redirect the judgment of the neighborhood onto my shoulders. She wanted everyone to believe that the quiet, reliable daughter had simply made a clerical error. She wanted to frame the foreclosure as my personal failure, shielding her golden son and her own forged signatures from the light of day. The conflict had finally stepped out of the shadows. The silent war we had been fighting in ledgers and ignored mailboxes was now standing in the center of the party. The guests stared at me, waiting to see how the accused daughter would explain the ruin of her parents. I reached into my leather tote bag and rested my hand on the cold metal rings of the black binder. I stepped away from the radiant heat of the propane tower. The grass felt soft under my shoes as I walked toward the center of the canvas tent. The neighbors parted, creating a narrow aisle between the high-top tables. My mother stood at the end of that aisle. She still clutched the foreclosure complaint in her left hand. Her right hand squeezed the stem of her champagne flute so tightly her knuckles were white. She expected me to crumble. She expected the quiet, compliant daughter to apologize, to take the blame for the ruined afternoon, and to promise to fix the error. I stopped 3 feet away from her. I looked at the printed stack of paper. Then I looked at her face. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or cry. I spoke with the steady, measured cadence of a professional auditor presenting a finalized ledger. I said, "There is no mistake with my payments, Mom. I stopped them 90 days ago." The words hung in the crisp October air. A woman standing to my left gasped softly. My mother's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The script she had written in her head, the one where she played the victim of my negligence, caught fire and burned to ash. Before she could recover, a heavy set of footsteps marched across the lawn. Greg broke away from his circle of admirers near the mahogany bar. He crossed the distance quickly, his face flushed with a sudden dark red heat. The bourbon in his rocks glass sloshed over the rim, staining the cuff of his tailored navy shirt. He was losing control of his stage, and he instinctively tried to bully his way back into power. He stepped between my mother and me. He used his height to tower over me. He pointed a finger at my face. He said, "You let the house go into default." Are you insane, Emily? You are supposed to be managing the primary account. He wanted to dominate the narrative. He wanted to frame the situation as my catastrophic failure to perform my assigned duty. I did not step back. I reached into my leather tote bag. My fingers found the cold metal zipper. I pulled it open and reached inside. I grasped the spine of the black vinyl binder. It was heavy. It contained the weight of 7 years of my life. I pulled it out and held it in my hands. I did not hand the papers to my brother or my mother. They would simply deny the contents or try to tear the pages. A financial audit requires a neutral third party to review the findings. I turned to my left. My Uncle Robert was standing near the edge of the circle. He is a structural engineer. He builds bridges. He understands the concept of load-bearing weight, and he respects mathematics. I opened the metal rings of the binder. The sharp snap echoed under the canvas roof. I pulled out a stapled packet of documents and handed it to Robert. I turned back to my mother and Greg. I addressed the crowd without looking directly at them. I laid out the math. I said, for the past 84 months, I paid $2,200 on the first of every month. I funded the primary mortgage from my personal checking account to keep a roof over my paralyzed father. My total principal and interest contribution to this property is $184,800. I paused, letting the sheer size of the number settle over the guests. The men Greg had been lecturing minutes ago were now staring at him with hardened eyes. I continued. I said, that was my side of the ledger, but 14 months ago, the co-signers on this property decided to leverage my credit. I pulled out the certified copy of the Delaware County Deed of Trust. I held it up so the blue ink of the notary seal was visible. I told them about the secret secondary mortgage. I stated the principal amount, $150,000. My mother took a step backward. She bumped into the center pole of the tent. I explained the mechanism of the theft. I said they needed a signature with a flawless credit history. So my mother used the durable power of attorney I signed 7 years ago. A document she claimed was only for medical emergencies. She acted as my legal agent to bind me to a 6-figure debt without my knowledge or consent. Robert flipped through the packet I gave him. He found the signature page. He looked at the printed power of attorney clause. He looked at my mother. His expression shifted from confusion to profound disgust. Greg tried to interrupt. He puffed out his chest and raised his voice. He said it was a bridge loan. He said I was blowing a temporary cash flow issue out of proportion. I reached into the binder one last time. I pulled out the printed Block Explorer spreadsheets. I did not give them to Robert. I held them directly in front of Greg's face. I said it was not a bridge loan. It was a margin call. I recited the dates and the timestamps. I told the neighborhood exactly where their visionary entrepreneur invested the stolen equity. I explained how he moved the funds to a high-risk trading protocol. I told them how the market crashed in November. I described the final, desperate trade at 2 a.m. I told them how the algorithm liquidated the account. 3 minutes. $150,000 reduced to zero. I lowered the paper. I looked Greg in the eye. I said, you did not build wealth. You gambled my credit score in the dark and lost everything. The silence that followed was suffocating. The illusion shattered permanently on the manicured lawn. Greg took a sudden, uncoordinated step backward. His heel caught the metal leg of a high-top table. He stumbled, losing his balance entirely. The crystal rock's glass slipped from his fingers. It shattered against the table leg, sending amber bourbon splashing across the front of his tailored navy suit pants and down to his leather shoes. The sharp smell of alcohol mixed with the cedar smoke. He did not even try to brush it off. He just stood there, dripping, his broad shoulders slumped. The expensive suit suddenly looked like a wet costume he had stolen. He stammered. He tried to string together his expensive vocabulary, mumbling something about a liquidity crisis and an unforeseen market correction. The words sounded hollow, pathetic, and entirely useless against the cold reality of the printed ledger. He looked exactly like what he was, a 34-year-old failure caught holding an empty bag. My mother dropped her champagne flute. The crystal hit the grass with a dull thud. The pale yellow liquid spilled over her leather shoes. She looked at the foreclosure complaint in her hand. She looked at the guests who were already walking toward their imported cars, eager to escape the blast radius of her humiliation. She had spent her adult life curating an image of effortless suburban superiority. She financed it with my salary. She protected it with lies. And in the span of 5 minutes, I had dismantled the entire structure, using nothing but mathematics and public records. I zipped my leather tote bag closed. I did not demand an apology. An apology is a social transaction, and they had no currency left to spend. I had delivered the truth. The audit was over. The only thing remaining was the fallout. The bank would take the bricks and the wood. The county sheriff would change the locks. And I had to figure out how to navigate the wreckage I had just created to save my own life. I walked away from the canvas tent and down the long asphalt driveway. The jazz music faded into the crisp autumn air behind me. I unlocked my sedan, got behind the steering wheel, and started the engine. I did not look in the rearview mirror as I drove out of the neighborhood. The performance was over. The actors had dropped their scripts. The audience was gone. The days that followed were defined by a heavy, grinding silence. The legal system stepped in to manage the wreckage. A foreclosure in the state of Pennsylvania is a methodical process. It does not operate on emotion. It operates on leverage. The Ohio lender filed the default judgment, but we did not wait for a judge to take pity on me. My binder of wire transfers and county records was not a defense. It was a weapon. David Miller bypassed the civil court and went directly to the legal department of the Ohio Bank. He handed them my audit. He showed them the timeline, the margin calls, and the undeniable proof that my mother committed a gross breach of fiduciary duty. He told them if they tried to attach my wages, we would file a countersuit for facilitating a fraudulent loan. We would tie their foreclosure up in litigation for half a decade. Banks do not like friction. They like math. They ran the numbers and realized I was too expensive to fight. They offered a settlement. They would take the property, direct all collection efforts at the co-signers, and completely sever my name from the deficiency judgment. They could not touch my salary. But severance is a legal term, not a clean getaway. The Chester County house was auctioned on the courthouse steps 4 months later. My mother and Greg were forced to pack 35 years of accumulated status into rented moving trucks. Stripped of the phantom wealth they stole to maintain their pride, they relocated to a cramped apartment next to an industrial park. Greg had to sell his custom monitors just to cover his portion of the security deposit. My mother was forced to take a job working a reception desk at a local dental clinic. The ivory silk suits and imported pearls were replaced by polyester scrubs and a plastic name tag. They are finally living the exact life they spent decades trying to outrun. If this were a scripted drama, that would be the triumphant conclusion. The antagonists get punished, and the protagonist walks away unharmed. But reality demands a heavy toll. The true cost of my survival was paid by my father. When the house was seized by the bank, my mother claimed she could not accommodate his medical bed in her new apartment. She stated she could not provide the necessary care while working full-time. The state intervened. My father was transferred to a Medicaid-funded nursing facility in a neighboring county. It is not a place with manicured lawns, private rooms, or attentive staff. It is a long, fluorescent-lit corridor. The air constantly smells of institutional bleach, boiled cabbage, and quiet resignation. I visit him every Sunday afternoon. I sit in a cracked vinyl chair next to his narrow bed. The stroke robbed him of his voice years ago, but his eyes still track my movements. I hold his hand. His knuckles are swollen from arthritis. I look at him and carry the heavy weight of knowing my decision put him in that room. I had to choose between his physical comfort and my own financial survival. I chose myself. It is a deeply painful reality. It is a stone I swallow every single day. I do not ask for his forgiveness because I know he would give it to me, and somehow that makes the guilt hurt worse. My own life did not magically transform into an effortless paradise. The court recognized I paid my share, but the primary loan still went into default with my name on the original note. My pristine credit score took a massive hit. It dropped 114 points in a single reporting cycle. I went from prime-tier borrowing to subprime risk. When the transmission on my 10-year-old sedan started slipping last winter, I had to finance a used replacement vehicle at an 11% interest rate. My monthly budget tightened considerably. Furthermore, untangling the legal knot was an expensive undertaking. I paid David Miller $6,000 in billable hours to formally dissolve the power of attorney. We had to ensure my name was permanently blocked from any future liabilities my mother might attempt to create. I drained my emergency savings to buy the legal armor required to keep my family away from my ledger. I lost my childhood home. I lost the fragile transactional relationship I maintain with my mother and brother. But I gained something that cannot be measured by a credit bureau. I gained pure freedom. I am sitting at the small dining table in my apartment. It is a Tuesday evening. Outside the window, a cold rain is falling against the glass. The streetlights cast a yellow glow across the wet pavement. The radiator in the corner of the living room clanks with its familiar, uneven rhythm. I am holding a ceramic coffee mug. It has a chipped handle. My father gave it to me when I graduated from college. The coffee is black and hot. I open my laptop. The screen illuminates the dark kitchen. I navigate to my banking portal. Today is the first of the month. For 7 years, this was the day I watched $2,200 vanish from my account to fund a life I was excluded from living. I click on the checking account summary. The page loads quickly. The balance is intact. My paycheck sits there, untouched by external demands, safe from margin calls and catered garden parties. Every cent on that screen belongs to me. I did not win a lottery. I did not receive a magical windfall. I survived a surgical extraction. I audited the trauma, calculated the acceptable losses, and cut the cord. The math is finally balanced. Walking away from toxic loyalty is never clean. It is a messy, expensive, and heartbreaking process. You realize that the people who demand the most sacrifice are often the ones who value you the least. You cannot force them to love you properly. You can only protect yourself from their failures. My name is Emily Louisa. I am an auditor, and my books are closed. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever had to calculate the cost of your own freedom and make the agonizing decision to walk away from the people who were supposed to protect you, I want to hear from you. Tell me your story in the comments. Let me know what boundary you had to draw to save yourself. And if you want to hear more stories about the quiet, unglamorous reality of taking your life back, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you know when the next video goes live. Thank you for listening.